This was a fantastic conversation with Mark. So he wrote a book called Screw Being Shy, which is why I had him on the show here. And I kind of expected, I don't know, typical advice about overcoming shyness and being more confident. But that is not at all what we got. So you're definitely going to love this conversation with Mark and the different ways he thinks about social anxiety, his own journey to overcoming it, and just the advice he has. We even talk a little bit about digital introversion, which is really interesting. Can kind of explain why some people who otherwise don't struggle for themselves out there can really struggle for themselves out there with video content and on social media. So great interview. You're going to enjoy it. You will notice that the production value is fairly low, we'll say. We had a lot of technical difficulties from the Zoom medium crashing a couple of times to choppy audio in the beginning, which actually led us to turn our cameras off midway through so that the audio quality could at least be better. But I hope that our struggles here can serve as an example for you, maybe some inspiration for you to get started putting your own content out there. Because this interview proves it doesn't have to be perfect to be valuable to people. And ultimately, I'm willing to bet that at the end of this interview, you're going to remember the value that you got from it and how interesting the conversation was and unique Mark's insights were. You'll remember that far more than you'll remember the technical difficulties that we experienced during this conversation. So, anyways, here's the interview. All right. Good morning, Mark. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Yeah, Jonathan, thanks
The
so much for having me.
first thing I want to ask you is going to be, oh yeah, sure thing. The first thing I want to ask you here is about the transition phase you went through in your life. So, first question I have is, can you describe to us your 18-year-old self? What were you like?
Yeah, so, for me, I was definitely born as an introvert. I remember, like, young kid having like a tight circle of friends, great time. My parents had come here from Egypt to America on the East Coast just a couple years before I was born. And they came here with like $200 in their pocket. And so I grew up with a very, very simple childhood. And between second and third grade, we ended up moving out of the city into a more rural, kind of small town area. And the really interesting part about this place that I lived in was that there was zero racial diversity. And this was also at the time of post 9/11 in America. And so if you were Middle Eastern, you just got dumped on. And so for me as a young kid, I faced extreme racism, bullying. People call me, a lot of different words I won't say here. And really what ended up happening was also at that same time, I had kind of began to get a lot of physical health issues. A lot of health issues that I see a lot of kids today in America getting, like ADD, asthma, issues with their skin, with their gut, appendix, stomach, insomnia. All those things kind of came at once. And so, physically speaking, like in my body, I felt like I had no energy at all. And so, kind of combined with these factors, I really entered in this bubble, this mentality in my head of the world is out there to get me. I should never speak up. And I just became that kid that just always looked down, didn't talk to anybody, didn't have any friends. As a result, I didn't play any sports, wasn't a part of any clubs, any groups, nothing. And so that was basically my life for a solid 10 years until I was 18. And I ended up going off to college. And I actually realized that I had social anxiety. Previously, up to that moment, I had no idea. I just thought that I was some like messed up kid with like some sort of like a moral failure. And so when I figured out I had social anxiety and I realized like, oh, wow, this is actually like this scientific health thing in my brain. And it's not so much like a character flaw within me. That's where things really began to change. But before things began to change, they began to change for the worse. And so when I was 18 years old, I kind of fell down a dark spiral in my life where my lifelong social anxiety transformed into social isolation. And I just didn't really talk to anybody or leave my apartment in college. And then I actually began to like get seriously depressed for the first time in my life. And at that same time, I was also trying to use food as a coping mechanism to help me deal with my emotions. But if anyone knows, that's not a good that's not a good plan. And next thing I know, I've gained like almost 70 pounds. I'm now 220 pounds. I'm obese for the first time in my life. And I actually begin to um, flirt with suicide. And so that for me was just sort of like a rock bottom. And this kind of happened at the end of 2015. And then after that, it was just a small series of steps, of different realizations, different things that kind of happened to me that eventually kind of transformed me into, by the time I was like 19, where I was basically a totally different person. And then that led me to like starting my business, my podcast, eventually this book. And yeah, it's been quite an interesting journey for like the last 4 or 5 years.
So before we dig into the transition, talk about now. You're 22 years old. Talk about now what your life is like, what you're doing, as far as like the what's on paper, what you're doing with your life, but also the person you are right now.
Yeah, definitely. So on paper, I run a podcast marketing agency. I am in an Amazon Prime documentary series called The Social Movement. I'm a speaker. I am a best-selling author of a book called Screw Being Shy. I host a top 100 podcast called Humans 2.0. I sit on the board of a education nonprofit. I advise some startups. I do a lot of different things. But quite frankly, like those are all cool, but those don't really necessarily in and of themselves bring me happiness. And for me, what really brings me happiness is not all the time, because I'm still human, but just having peace in my own head. And I remember like for most of my life, it almost kind of felt like I was like struggling against life, against reality itself. Like I was in this wrestling match all the time. And that created such extreme anxiety and pressure and shame for me. And so again, I'm not perfect. I have bad times. I have bad weeks. I think a lot of people are facing that right now with what's going on in the world. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's like social anxiety used to have a 99% like death grip control on my life, controlling my every move. And now it probably has anywhere from like 2% to 5% control over my life. And so I don't really think that these problems can be entirely eliminated, but the fact that I can just walk into a room and just talk to people and not have my brain to try to get me talked out of it and enter into this panic state, that to me is like the most amount of progress ever. And like I have great mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, physical health. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm really proud of myself and a lot of these sort of not things on paper that I've been able to do with my life. And then ever since then, it's just about, trying to throw the rope down and trying to get other people to climb out of this, because this is a serious problem. And we can get into it if you want to, but, this is sort of my part and what I can think I could do to the world, because for a lot of people, this is an invisible problem, or it's just not that serious if they don't really deal with this.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Side of this, or a lot of this is invisible, because again, people see it as some kind of moral failing, so they try to keep it covered up, so we don't even necessarily know who goes through it and how much. So
yeah,
I love that you're willing to share about this. So going back to 18-year-old self, right? As things were starting to change. When you first got to the point where you said, you know what, I've got to make a change in my life, who or what did you turn to learn how to even make that change?
Yeah. So it's really interesting, right? So when I was at like my version of rock bottom, I actually had no idea that I was in rock bottom. And like, there's this quote that says, you can't see the picture when you're in the frame. And so for me, what I was really trying to do was, in my dark times, and I live in Boston, I would try to walk around like the really dangerous neighborhoods at times at night. And I would just like fantasize about someone walking up to me and killing me and ending my life, because I was just in so much pain. I didn't know how to deal with it. And so on one of those nights, I remember like hearing silence. I remember not like, for the first time in my life, not getting any distractions in both the outside world and also in my head. And I kind of felt like I felt my intuition for the first time in my life. And so when that happened, I remember just kind of running home and looking at myself in the mirror. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, that was the first time that I actually realized that I was overweight. Previously, up to that time, I was just caught up in like this trance and like this dream for like several months. And when like that emotional event happened, and I came running home at like 2 or 3 a.m. and I looked at myself in the mirror, I was just like, wait, like, who am I? And I remember like feeling for the first time that my pants were too tight and just kind of realizing who I was. And so that was the first problem that I could see, because at that time, you know, all these words today that we use, like mindset, mental health, self-development, I didn't know what any of those things were at all. And so the only issue, the only problem that I could see was the outside world, and that was my physical weight. And so for me, I like remember just like Googling, like, how do I lose weight? And like for anyone else
Yeah.
who's done that, you know, you're going to get, you know, the whole health and wellness industry's confusion of answers, funded by billions of dollars of, hey, drink this detox tea, try this diet, try this, try that. And so I eventually ended up stumbling across this guy named Dave Asprey, and he's the founder of Bulletproof. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Bulletproof coffee, where you put in butter in your coffee and you mix it around with MCT oil. And so I read his book, and that was the first time when I actually began to understand a much more deep understanding of food and of nutrition. Previously, up to that time, I had just thought of it in terms of like, hey, if I eat too much food, then I'll gain weight. That's the only thing that I kind of saw in food. But when I was reading Dave Asprey's book, he was talking about hormones and this kind of mineral and this kind of vitamin doing this to this kind of fat. And it was almost just like this veil was just like uncovered. And I was like, huh. So then I actually began to follow the diet. And I mean, it's pretty interesting. I suggest people look at it. But basically what it advocates for is just eating a healthy, natural, whole foods diet with like vegetables and a lot of healthy dietary fat that prioritizes mental performance. And so I remember beginning to eat like that for maybe a month or two. And not only did I literally lose all the weight in a very short amount of time, but I felt like my brain turned on for the first time. And when my brain turned on for the first time, I had way more access to energy of who I actually was. You know, if you remember going back to when I was telling you the stories of when I was a kid, I had a lot of physical health issues, and those drained my energy, and I was on a ton of different medications. And when I kind of went through this health transformation journey, I remember going back to my doctors and them doing a ton of different tests and them saying to me like, hey, we don't know what happened, but yeah, you don't have to take this medicine anymore. Whatever you had is now gone. And so I had a tremendous amount of energy for the first time in my life. And not only did that happen, but it's like when I had more energy, that's when I started to like go for walks outside. And then after that, I started to go for runs. And I had never exercised regularly in my life ever. And then when you start to eat healthy and exercise, then you start to sleep well for like 7 to 8 hours for the first time in my life. I used to be horrible at sleep. And then all these things begin to add up on each other. And then I started to like read more books and then understand like, wow, all these books that I'm reading, they all talk about meditation, or they all talk about journaling, or they all talk about the power of gratitude, or they all talk about like this habit. And so I just began to stack these things on top of each other. And again, it wasn't like an overnight transformation. It's not like I just came home and I was like, I'm gonna change my whole life around and I'm gonna do this, and that. No, it was literally like a series of just small steps every day that eventually kind of gave me, whether it was optimism or whether it was faith or whether it was energy to just keep going. And here I am today. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
Uh-huh. So, obviously shyness and social, introversion, social anxiety, all that stuff can really be negative and limit you in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. But do you see there'd be any upsides to shyness?
Yeah, man. So this is it, right? So before we talk about this, we kind of have to take a step back because being an introvert, a lot of people don't really understand what that means. But being an introvert can be a superpower. And the actual definition of an introvert is someone whose brain predominantly focuses on the internal world. their thoughts, emotions, ideas, and they get energy from that. And so you could be an introvert who is quiet and likes their solitude. There's nothing wrong with that. But you could also be an introvert who maybe begins to develop a pattern of being shy. And when it comes to shyness, I mean, again, shyness is totally okay. It's a totally natural feeling to a degree. And so it's totally normal to feel shy if maybe you're doing something for the first time, or maybe you're going to an event for the first time and you don't know anybody for like the first 5 minutes. That's totally okay. But there are people, usually introverts, who are more susceptible to this problem, although this can also happen to extroverts, where they form a pattern of being shy all the time. No matter what environment they're in, no matter who they're talking to, they're always shy. And if that happens long enough, then their mind and body form an anxiety response where they make each other basically freak out, and it essentially traps somebody in their brain that has social anxiety, who wants to talk to people, but their brain doesn't even let them. And it's not because they're antisocial. It's not because they don't want to talk to you. It's because they have actually a potential mental condition that is the most common anxiety condition in America. And so do I think there are upsides to being shy? That can depend. Do I think there's upsides to being an introvert? 100,000% for sure. And so I think the sort of upside to being shyness, you have to take a look at the root problem. And so for me, what happened to me was I was psychologically traumatized because of the events that happened to me early on with racism and bullying that created this defense mechanism, and that is social anxiety. A lot of people think that social anxiety is something random, and the reality is it is not random. Social anxiety is a coping mechanism. It's a defense response to your brain because something happened to you. And so for me, when I was experiencing that trauma, my brain basically said to itself, hey man, people are rejecting you, people are judging you, people are mocking you, so never talk again to people. That actually is what social anxiety is. And so when you look at it from that perspective, I mean, I guess it has upsides of not being, maybe judged or mocked even more. But I mean, that's very much living a suppressed life. And that can be very, very dangerous. And so that's the way that I would sort of describe to someone, because shyness is being nervous to talk to somebody. You shouldn't be nervous to talk to anybody, because the matter of the fact is that's just not necessarily not normal, but that can harm you in your career, in your life, with your family. And I know for certain the key to life, the key to happiness is expressing your true self. Because if you can't express your true self, then you're not actually living your true life. And if you look at the number one cause of regret for people who are on their deathbeds, it's living a life that other people expected of them, not the life they wish on their own. And so for me, that's what I would tell somebody who asked me if shyness can be a potential upside.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost like introversion, super strong upside to that, which I can definitely see. And
Yeah, and I mean,
doing as well.
and the big thing here to note, Jonathan, is like social anxiety is not you being afraid to ask a girl to the prom. You know what I mean? Like, that's totally normal.
Mm-hmm.
Social anxiety is you being in the classroom or you being in an office in a meeting and you looking down at your shoe and seeing you have a smudge, a 1-inch brown smudge on the left side of your shoe that nobody can really see. And then you look at other people's shoes in the room and you're like, oh my God, I'm the only person that likes this, that has shoes like this. What if my boss sees it? What if this employee sees it and they make fun of me and they think I'm terrible? And then at the front of the room, if people like are in desks and someone like accidentally makes eye contact with you when they're trying to talk to somebody else, and then your brain is like, oh my God, are they judging me? Are they talking crap about my back? That's what social anxiety is. It's a real legitimate mental issue that, quite frankly, if it's not addressed, it actually impacts every area of your life. And for me, when I was writing the book, Screw Being Shy, I actually realized that I had to write it because when I was looking at the statistics and I saw that social anxiety is not only the most common anxiety condition in America, but out of all the anxiety conditions, it is the most correlated with substance abuse and social isolation, both of which are tightly linked to suicide, where I almost fell into, where I almost killed myself. And so this is a major, major issue that, again, like I said, is largely invisible to both those that haven't even experienced this and to people who do experience this. Like, I didn't know I had social anxiety until I was 18 years old. And so, there can be a lot of sort of things about that. And for a lot of people that do have social anxiety, a lot of them become alcoholics. A lot of them become dependent on a substance to shift their state of mind to actually get themselves to talk to people. And that can lead to depression, that can lead to suicide. And so this is a major, major problem that is actually usually diagnosed as other problems. But when you look at the root, it's actually social anxiety. It's actually your psychology and your mental health.
So if you're somebody who has that level of social anxiety, where that self-talk you described is happening, right?
Yeah.
Is there any advice you can give them of how to move away from that self-talk of people are judging me, people are looking at my scuff on my shoe, move away from that negative self-talk to something a little more healthy? Is there any way that you can
Yeah.
choose your self-talk and move your mind out of that state?
Yeah, absolutely. And so first and foremost, the first rule to understand is that you cannot defeat a thought with a thought. And so a lot of people in like this entrepreneurial self-improvement world, they'll tell you that you have to think better thoughts. You have to think more positively. And for sure, that's true, but you can't think your way there. And so what I always tell people is you have to start with the underlying biochemistry. You have to start with what's going on under the hood. Because, the matter of the fact is, Jonathan, life, the way that each person listening to this podcast experiences life is a series of your brain and body performing trillions of operations, cell by cell, your brain chemicals being secreted, and neurotransmitters being fired. That is essentially what creates our reality. And so when you look at people who have potential mental health issues like social anxiety, a key neurotransmitter comes up called serotonin. And serotonin has been talked by a lot of mental health professionals to leadership people. And serotonin, this regulates a lot of things in our body, from regulating our mood to our sleep to even regulating how we function in social groups. And so serotonin is extremely, extremely important for social anxiety. And so when you take a look at it, most of the research from about 20 years ago from neuroscientists and researchers, they were saying that because serotonin is a neurotransmitter, it's got to be in the brain. And it actually turns out that's only partially true. And they've actually found that 90% of serotonin is not in the gut. Only 5 to 10% of serotonin is in our brain. The rest, 95%, is in this vast ecosystem called a gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome is this ecosystem of trillions of bacteria that are in between your intestine and stomach that have formed a symbiotic relationship with your body for thousands of years that does a lot of complex functions across our entire body. For example, when you go to eat a food, you are not actually the one that is eating it first, because there's a lot of foods from just everyday plants that human beings cannot digest. And so when we eat them, our gut microbiome digests them first, and then it sends it off to our body. There is a direct nerve that connects the gut microbiome to the brain called the vagus nerve. And so where I talk about this in my book, under the subsection, it's called First My Gut Broke and Then My Brain Broke. And I talk about the only time in my life where I was seriously depressed and suicidal was when I gained a tremendous amount of weight because I was eating a ton of crappy junk food. And so literally the number one way to improve serotonin at a biochemical level is by your dietary choices. Aside from that, the two common causes of a dysfunctional gut microbiome, which can cause these mental health problems in the first place, often comes from, number one, psychological trauma, which I talked about, which enables your nervous system to create chronic stress where it's constantly freaking out, and therefore it can't pass on that necessary energy to your gut microbiome. Number two is your dietary choices. And so if you can begin to look at both of those things, and maybe it's you go see a psychotherapist, or you go see a therapist, or you just kind of begin to dig deeper down into your psychology, into your past as a kid, and what events traumatized you. And then while also trying to eat better food. Again, there's no such thing as a universal healthy diet. But what I would say to people is make sure you're eating foods that agree with your stomach. Make sure you're eating a lot of natural foods. Eat a lot of vegetables, eat a lot of healthy dietary fat. And the one golden rule is avoid any kind of processed food. Avoid anything made by a factory or by a scientist that doesn't really care about your health and just cares about profitability. And then try to limit alcohol. Avoid any kind of drink that has sugar or whatever. Those things are absolutely toxic. And so, yeah, and then the biggest part about this too is this is not just about mental health. Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation, they actually did a worldwide study where they were trying to find the number one cause of death. And they showed that the number one cause of death in the world is processed food, alcohol, and soda. Those are the three common causes, the top causes of death that approximately kill 15 million people every single year. And yet when I was growing up, nobody told me about this stuff. When I was growing up, nobody taught me that you shouldn't drink, 6 bottles of Coca-Cola or 6 bottles of Gatorade. And so that's what I would say, people. If you can begin to do that, then you completely change your life. And what I also say too is, like, a lot of people know this stuff, but just knowing it doesn't actually change their behavior. A lot of people, and I'm not trying to say this to make fun of or say this lightly, a lot of people are addicted to junk food. I used to 100% be addicted to junk food. And here's the craziest part, Jonathan. I talk about this study in my book done by the University of Maryland. And they showed that they took people who were addicted to hard drugs like crack, cocaine, meth, heroin, and they took people who were addicted to junk food, people who consumed the American standard diet, and they did scans. They took scans of their brain, and they found that their brains actually looked the same. And that's because junk food mirrors highly palatable, addictive foods in our neurochemistry. And so there's a lot of, like, obese people, for example, people who have diabetes, who say, oh yeah, I'm not disciplined. I can't eat healthy. And here's the thing to understand. You have to understand that it's not a discipline problem. The real problem is that your neurochemistry has been hijacked by companies, by manufacturers, making processed food-like substances that haven't existed longer than 50 years. And so what I tell people is, don't focus on not eating junk food, because that is a brutal, toxic cycle that can, quite frankly, destroy somebody's self-esteem and make them an addict. What I would say instead is focus on eating healthy foods. It's all about substitution. It's all about adding healthier things, because when you can add healthier things and your gut microbiome slowly but surely begins to function normally, then what happens is you're not as pulled to the addiction of junk food or toxic foods. And so that's probably the most important thing that I would tell somebody. And this problem really impacts all of us, whether you have a mental health problem or you don't. And so that's what I would say to people. Address your biochemistry, address your neurotransmitters by focusing on your food. And then number one is focusing on your psychological trauma. Number two, focusing on your dietary choices every single day.
Oh my goodness. That we could go, like I said, we could go on for that for eternity. We'll kind of, come into the home stretch here. Since this is a podcast dedicated to people who are looking to get more comfortable putting themselves out there on camera, being in front of the camera, putting out video content, communicating through video. Something in your book that I thought would be good for you to touch on is this concept of digital introversion. Could you explain a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah. So this is it, man. So personally for me, I didn't struggle too much when it came to kind of putting myself online, because I had already began to tackle my social anxiety in real life. And so I speak to a lot of people who are smart, who are intelligent, who are very hardworking, who may not even be socially anxious in real life, but when it comes to them recording themselves online or on a video, it can be extremely challenging for them. And so number one is you have to actually look at this problem from a different angle. And this is actually the same problem that males face during sex if they have just been educated about sex from watching porn. And what I'm talking about is this. So for a lot of older people older like that are not in their 20s, they mostly saw the media before social media. They saw it on TV, they saw it on movies, they saw it on film. And what's the similarity between all those things? Movies, film, news. Everyone in that production is perfect. Like, everyone is wearing makeup. Everyone has a script that they're following. They're actors. They've got to say this. It's got to be perfect. The lighting is perfect. And so that's a major issue that we have. And so when somebody puts a camera in front of their face, their brain is immediately experiencing performance anxiety, where they are thinking that they have got to do this perfect production because they're now in front of a camera, when they don't really understand that you don't have to do that. That's just an option. And a lot of people who, post great videos online, they're not even that highly well produced. And so that's a major sort of angle to begin to look at it that way. And so when you're actually in the moment, you just have to realize that this is just you and an inanimate object talking together. And nobody can see this if you don't want them to. You can edit it out. And so that's number one. Number two is I'd probably say, imagine you're talking to a friend. I don't necessarily do this all the time, but I do this on my podcast, because on my podcast, I have a series where I talk about just things by myself, solo. And sometimes that could be pretty hard to just talk in a room by myself for 15 minutes. And so I imagine that I'm either talking to a friend of mine, or I imagine I'm speaking to an entire crowd. And then number three is, I would say, a big way to conquer problems in life is to actually not focus on yourself. So for example, when I was writing this book, it was terrible and it was terrifying. And so the only thing that was pushing me through was man, I got to write this book for my 18-year-old self. Man, I got to write this book for the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people out there that face this issue. And so, yeah, if you're recording random videos that nobody cares about, this might be a little bit harder to do. But I know for me, based on the stuff that I talk about, I'm always okay, I would rather sacrifice, 60 seconds of me feeling weird than to potentially, have this video reach hundreds of thousands of people, or thousands of people, or hundreds of people that could potentially benefit. And so those are three ways to begin to look at digital introversion. And then again, I would say is if you've tried these and they don't work, it means that you're actually too much of an introvert in real life, and you may actually have social anxiety. And so, of course, my general rule of thumb is before you begin to apply these things to the digital world and to social media, make sure you're actually doing these things with your own brain, all the things that we've been talking about, if you do face this issue first, because that's the deeper end, that's the back end, that's going to get you way more results in your outer life and in other areas.
Well, never did I expect when you came on this podcast to talk about overcoming shyness for the primary theme of the conversation be to fix your diet, fix your biochemistry, which will in turn fix your neurochemistry, which will in turn allow you to act better. Because you're right, most general advice and self-help skips the first three steps and just focus on
Yep.
your thoughts and fixing your thoughts, ignoring the first three steps of your diet, your biochemistry, your neurochemistry, then come the thoughts.
Yeah,
So I
exactly.
love
And
that
and
you
then
you
and
put
then
them in that order. It's so cool.
yeah, exactly, man. I break a lot of this down in my book, and obviously, food is not like the biggest thing ever, but it's a pretty big thing. It's a pretty big step that someone can begin to nail down. And yeah, I mean, I break a lot of this down aside from the biochemistry to other things to like how to change the way you think about yourself, how to not overthink. I break these all down in my book that people can check out. It's called Screw Being Shy. It's on Amazon, but probably the fastest place to get it right now, depending on when this podcast is up, is Barnes and Nobles because of Amazon's shipment delays. So yeah, I mean, people are interested, they
Yeah,
could definitely check that out, and the audiobook is coming soon by next week.
cool. Well, that's what I went looking for before this podcast. I was like, man, is it an audiobook yet? Because I'll be real, man,
Yeah,
I don't think I've read a physical book in a long, long time. Where the audiobooks I can consume no problem.
yeah, definitely,
All
man.
right,
I'll let you know when it's up. You gotta check it out.
cool. All right. Well, I will be sure to link to the Barnes and Noble in the body of this. If the audiobook is up when I publish this, then I'll also link to that as well so people can find the audiobook. What are some other ways people can find you, Mark? How do they best way to connect with you and get engaged with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty active on my LinkedIn. I'm also pretty active on my Instagram. But a good central spot for people to check out what I've got going on is just to head to my website, which is just my first and last name.com, MARKMETRY.com. You can check out anything I've got going on. And yeah, Jonathan, I appreciate you for doing this. It was great.
Yeah, it was a great talk. Thanks.